At the 2010 trade deadline, the New Jersey Devils, well on their way to their 9th division title in 12 years, traded a gaggle of players who put together did not amount to Ilya Kovalchuk for Ilya Kovalchuk, and a couple of other things. For those out of the loop, Kovalchuk was an elite, probably franchise goal scorer. He ruled the roost in terms of lighting the lamp since he came into the league. However, a depressing first-round loss to the Flyers cut that season short. The glory days of the early 2000s were now part of an older decade that was getting smaller and smaller in the rearview. But the team signed Kovalchuk to a 15-year, $102 million contract. Or they tried to, and after running the gamut of arbitration, they succeeded. Ilya Kovalchuk would be the new face of the Devils franchise for at least the 2010s. After a dismal start to the 2011 season, partially due to a season-ending injury for Zach Parise, Coach John McClain was fired and Jacques Lemaire was rehired. McClain would have been fired sooner, but he was groomed for that position, and it was thought that GM Lou Lamoriello didn't want to give up on his project that easily. In any case, Lemaire and Kovalchuk turned it around, but the damage was done. Despite a valiant effort, they still missed the playoffs by 10 points. 2012 saw the additions of Peter Sikora, Alexei Ponikarovsky, Ryan Carter, Marek Zidlitsky, and coach Pete DeBoer. Adam Henrique replaced the injured Travis Zajac and was a revelation. The rejuvenated team nearly went the distance, defeating the arch-rival Rangers in the East Final, before getting stomped by the Kings. In 2013, after offensive dynamo Zach Parise left in free agency, the team was streaky with a sputtering offense and missed the playoffs altogether. Unlike 2012, where spotty goaltending could be offset by an average goal support, now they didn't even have that, lighting the lamp only 112 times, third worst in the league. And that was only the start of the bad news at the end of the season. With 12 years and 77 million clams left on the table, Ilya Kovalchuk retired from the NHL. This instantly put the Devils in a bind. Who could replace Kovalchuk? On top of losing Parise the year prior. Free agency options were slim, to say the least. It seemed like every free agent who was a highest scorer in the past had halved their output specifically for the lockout-shortened season. Nathan Horton, Stephen Weiss, David Clarkson. Jerome McGinley was really good, but at 35, there'd be a risk. But apparently, Lou Lamoriello thought differently than I do about age, because for offensive help, he signed a guy who was almost 6 years older than McGinley, Jaromir Jagr, 11 days after Kovalchuk's retirement. The lightness of the deal's terms, 1 year for $2 million, mitigated a lot of the risk involved. He would be 42 at season's end, though he did spank the league for 35 points in 45 games at that age. Knee-deep in his cool old man phase, apparently the Devils were his next stop. Not exactly a scorer quite of Kovalchuk's caliber, not as young, not as crafty, not at his peak, but it's Jagr. Let's see how well he does. One Jagr isn't going to cover an entire Kovalchuk in 2014, though. So the Devils decided to absolutely splurge. They signed veteran scoring winger Michael Ryder from the Canadiens for a 2-year, $7 million deal. And then they coughed up $24 million to land Ryan Clough, a quality throwback winger who played a power forwards game with a noticeable scoring ability. He actually hit 50 or 60 points thrice in his career. The kind of guy every team would love to have. Now for the re-signings. The Devils shored up their ranks by inking Adam Henrique long-term, which was a very popular move. He was a young, hard-working, defensively responsible center with a scoring touch. Another guy who every team would kill for. And he's still playing to this day. Dinas Zubris, owner of the coolest name ever, was extended for 3 years. He was a massive, versatile forward who never quite found a scoring touch, but fit the Devils' grinding style to a T. He and Henrique provided even more depth at center behind Travis Zajac, and his longtime teammate on the wing, Patrick Elias. As synonymous with the 21st century Devils as any player with any team, they were perfect for DeBoer's system. The former was a top-line defensive center consistently tasked with shutting down the opponent's best players. While Zajac didn't really score that much, he was a face-off god and took so very few penalties. Elias was 37, but an equally effective and intelligent two-way forward with an underrated scoring ability. He was natively a left wing, but could slot in at center as well if the need arose. Together, they were an embarrassment of riches and versatility for the New Jersey Devils. Are you seeing a pattern in playing styles here? On a defensive team, obviously the defense are the defenders who def the most ends, so it makes sense that Andy Green would be crunching the most minutes for them. He was a pure shutdown defenseman, whose elite positioning and angling made up for his lack of size. The next big ice time eater was Marek Zidlitsky, who was actually an offensive defenseman with a big slap shot, but like every offensive defenseman, was spotty in his own zone, to say the least. Sometime partner Mark Fane was a bare-bones defenseman. He was big, positioned well, no offense to speak of really. He moved the puck okay. In other words, he was Pete DeBoer's wet dream. Now on to the goalies. Remember when I said the Devils had spotty goaltending? It was becoming a worrying pattern. Martin Brodeur is the quintessential New Jersey Devil and one of the greatest goalies ever. To say he was a big part of 3 Stanley Cup wins across 9 years would be a big understatement. The fans and executives of the Devils owe him a massive debt for the success he helped provide. But at the end of 2013, he just wasn't the same guy. He'd be 41 this season, and all of his personal stats were far lower than what he'd consistently been putting up for the last 15 years. They weren't bad enough to totally write him off, especially not with his track record, but the aura around him was fading. Many still clung to it, though. And why wouldn't they? It was Martin Brodeur. They knew he deserved the keys to the castle through thick and thin. But before the season, as the Devils hosted the 2013 NHL Draft, they executed a trade, sending their first-round pick to the Vancouver Canucks for goaltender Corey Schneider. At this point in his career, Schneider was a stellar backup, and all he needed to become a bona fide, possibly elite starter were the starts. With Brodeur fading, that seemed to be all the more likely. It was an ideal scenario for him, a larger role on a retooled team that was in dire need of the services that only he could provide. Unfortunately, he lost the season opener in Pittsburgh, and none of the 18 skaters scored despite outplaying the Penguins. The very next night, Martin Brodeur would get the start for their home opener, squaring off against the Islanders. The teams traded goals in each period, but one young buck named Damien Brunner potted 2 for the Devils, including the first of the season. Signed from a PTO out of camp, Brunner was a middle-six scorer who had come to the NHL from Europe last year at the ripe old age of 26, and put up solid numbers with Detroit. He was in his prime, and it looked to be like a dark horse kind of a signing, especially if 2 goals in his first home game was anything to go by. But with each team getting a goal in each period, that meant we were going to extra innings. I can't find footage of every attempt in the shootout, but the Islanders went 1 for 6. That's bad. The Devils were 0 for 6. And so they lost in a shootout. Okay, it was a game lost to breakdowns and poor goaltending from Brodeur. Just one game, no big deal. But the Devs were destined for that dreaded 5-game road trip out through Western Canada. But it started out great. Yager, Brunner, Ryder, the guys who were all brought in to dent the twine, did. They had a lead decently into the third, and they blew it. Eberle gets Brodeur down and roofs it high blocker. Damien Brunner lost it on the Forsberg. David Perron did the exact same thing as Eberle. He scored. Clough gets LaBarbera down, but he extends just far enough to rob him. Devils lose. Winless in the first 3 games. A little bit of a red light maybe. Corey Schneider's homecoming to Vancouver was almost a carbon copy though. Yager and Elias got the Devils a 2-goal lead, but in less than 5 minutes, some friendly fire deflections and poorly timed injury-induced line changes evened it right back up. And another double deflection handed New Jersey another loss. But at least they stole a point. It would be the last they earned on that road trip. They had 2 separate leads against Calgary, blew them both, and gave up the backbreaker with less than 3 to go in the game. Against the Jets, they would have been absolutely walked were it not for Corey Schneider keeping them to 1 goal in 59 minutes. But the offense just couldn't get anything done, and Ryan Clough would be out over 2 months with injury. And against Ottawa, Martin Brodeur had another rough night. He let in 1 bad goal, 2 bad goals, and a third to abort an almost comeback. Just like that, the New Jersey Devils have started the season winless in 7 games. But the Devils' defense was good. Their expected goals against per 60 was 1.94 at 5v5, 7th best in the league. It was just their offense that was streaky. They'd disappear for half the game, and half they did show up in was too little time to salvage the game. Plenty of top-level players had no production yet, and the schism in goaltending wasn't large. Both Brodeur and Schneider weren't good on the whole, but Brodeur had been just as spotty in net as he had been in the prior seasons. Some people's frustrations with him tentatively started to bubble over into the public discourse, but they were quickly shouted down because, what true Devils fan is going to believe Martin Brodeur is washed? Come on. Any drop in his play would be mitigated by him and Schneider sharing the starter's net equally. At least, that seemed to be the message Pete DeBoer was putting down. It would have to work soon, because coming home after half a month, the Devils would be facing their most bitter rivals, Schneider and Lundqvist in net. Did they get the win?
Under some pressure now, Volchenkov with a pistol and a rebound. Opportunity here for Henry, left side with speed. Brodeur between the circles. Instead back to the left point for Zidnicki. Across it goes. That shot by Salvador stopped, and the rebound score.
On the scoreboard, yes. Their first win of the season was a 4-0 shutout of the Rangers, but it would cost Bryce Salvador. A bad fall into the boards caused a hip injury that would linger and linger. Unfortunately, like many of the injuries he suffered throughout his career, it was a pretty brutal game that took pieces out of multiple Devils, but they shrugged it off with the typical gusto. In a 4-1 loss to Columbus, Salvador only played 11 minutes, and he didn't play in the next game at all. So, a young gun got his first crack at the lineup. Eric Jelena was an up-and-coming prospect who would get an extended look the more Bryce Salvador was out of the lineup. Writer John Fisher once called his slap shot the truth, because it hurt. Eric Jelena's a pretty funny dude. He hoped to bring some real good production to an otherwise lackluster power play, and he got his first NHL goal to give the Devils a 2-1 lead, but after Daniel Sedin tied it up halfway through regulation, we wouldn't see any more goals. It had been a fortnight or so, but we would get the skills competition. It was a duel between Schneider and Luongo, who were both pretty good in the shootout historically. The 48% Mike Santorelli was up first for the Canucks, and he just beat Schneider on a super quick release. Travis Zajac, 6 for 19 in his career, tried kind of the same move but missed the net. Daniel Sedin was only 4 for 22 in the Gimmick, and he looked it, not fooling Schneider once. Adam Henrique's career to that point wasn't really long enough to have a shootout reputation either way.
Off the post!
For the first time in the season, the Devils had the opposing goalie beat, but that extra inch to the right just wasn't there. Alex Edler missed his game-winning attempt on Schneider, leaving it to Patrick Elias to keep the Devils' hopes alive.
Elias trying to keep the game alive. Saved by Luongo, and the Canucks have won it.
Chico had the same question I did.
How does this not go in?
The no-touch deke is a great move by Elias, but as he goes 5-hole, Luongo swings his left leg back to close off the opening. Everything but pay dirt. The Devils lose. In 3 games, they hadn't scored once in the shootout. To close out the month, the Devils treated us to some exciting hockey. Against the Bruins, they got steamrolled in the first half of the game, down 3-1, but they slowly ran it back. Damian Brunner got them within 1 with less than a minute to go in the second, and then a bloodying high stick against him and a delay of game in the last 2 minutes gave the Devils an ultra-rare 6-on-3.
Back to Zidlicki. Zidlicki holds. 1:10 to go. The crowd up. Zidlicki scores! Mark Zidlicki with his first goal in 26 games. Yager in front. Here's Green. He scores! Turnabout is fair play.
Green and Zidlicki finally get their first goals of the season to lift the Devils to their second victory. They scored 4 power play goals, which for this team was unheard of. But hey, the journey of 1,000 PPGs begins with a single slash. Brodeur only had to make 16 stops against Tampa 2 days later, and just like that, the Devils had their first winning streak of the season. Whoopee. They still had to make their way out of the basement, but if they could get that goal support that was demonstrated against the Bruins in heroic fashion, and if their goaltending situation got squared away, they might just find themselves in the playoff race come the new year. After all, their defense was still lugging the mail, and at 1.64, they were tied for the second lowest expected goals against per 60 in the league. They just weren't allowing the other team to get good looks. Inconsistent goaltending made their defense appear not as elite as it was, but we know the truth on this channel. Unfortunately, the questions that haunted the Devils in October would continue into the winter months. So let's start November by not scoring at all in 2 different games. The Flyers, who just had this done to them by the Capitals, responded the only way their little orange hearts knew how, to play an equally hideous game against the Devils. There were 31 shots in this game. Total. Neither team played well, they all squandered opportunities, and the one goal the Flyers scored was the most pedestrian deflection you've ever seen. It was a terrible game of hockey. It reminds me of Giants-Eagles in Week 16 of 2015. It was a terrible game of football. Although I will say, I think the worst game of football is more fun to watch than the worst game of hockey. That's how bad it can get. Against the Wild, the Devils were just sleepwalking. Minnesota was kept to only 19 shots, but 3 of them got past Schneider anyway. Would somebody help justify the defense's wages? I don't think I used that phrase right. Anyway, absolutely suffocating the other team's offense ain't worth much if you can't throw some of it back over the fence. But in the next game, they did. Martin Brodeur had a really stout game in net, and a few Devils returned from injury, and the offense was able to put the game away courtesy of a Jágr empty netter. 24 hours later, they rode that momentum north of the border, where they had a stellar, end-to-end offensive game against the most media-saturated franchise in hockey. Unfortunately, Jonathan Bernier played out of his mind that night, allowing through 65 minutes what Corey Schneider allowed. 1 goal. Here we are again. The shootout would decide which goalie's stellar game would go down as a W. Mason Raymond had one of the shootout attempts of all time, but missed. Ryder went for an old-fashioned snipe, but Bernier read it all the way. Phil Kessel had the entire left side of the net open, but tried to go 5-hole on a well-positioned Schneider. Zajac tried to beat Bernier with speed, and he did. But he hit the post. On JVR's attempt, Schneider didn't really come out that far, and being a little static and a little deep in his net, Van Riemsdyk just sunk it. Henrique outflanked Bernier, but missed the net. Devils lose. But they got 3 of 4 points in those last 2 games, which they played really, really well in. That's a good sign. They just need to keep it up. They trucked Nashville 5-0. Full stop. No, they got luckies, or there were times when the Preds looked still in it. No, they dominated. And against the Rangers, they had to weather a few storms, but they won that one too. They ran into 2014 Ben Scrivens against LA. Can't win them all. But even after Schneider put up a .950 save percentage in that game, Brodeur put up a .964 against the Penguins. And starting off the 3-game road trip to Southern California, the Devils traded 2 lead changes with the Ducks before who else but Jaromir Jágr scored in the final minute to send it to OT, where a Ducks' own goal won it. The Devils' first post-regulation win of the season, 1/4 of the way through it. But the real thriller would come the following night against the Kings. The Devils' expected goals for percentage in this game was 24.61, the worst they would have in any game all season. But Corey Schneider became a god and stopped nearly 3 goals above expected, forcing overtime, where this madness happened.
The brakes on, plays it for Jágr. He scores! Jaromir Jágr, the game winner in overtime, and the Devils beat the Kings 2-1.
Pulling out 2 points despite being completely outplayed just was not in the DNA of the Devils who played in October. But here they were, 9-8-5, going 6-1-1 in their last 8. Good enough for 3rd in the Metro. They didn't get that same luck against the Sharks, who squarely beat them, nor against the Jets and Hurricanes in 2 frustratingly close losses. And all of a sudden, concern started to tickle at the brains of Devils fans. Until the next game, where they smoked the Hurricanes, and should have smoked the Sabres, but just couldn't find Twine in OT, leaving it until right when it seemed like we'd have to suffer through another shootout.
Here comes Green, lays it across for Bernier. Steve Bernier over the line, shoots, he scores! Steve Bernier wins it in overtime!
At fake 500, the Devils were where they deserved to be. Inconsistent offense and inconsistent goaltending gets you about there in most seasons if you have a sparkling defense. And in November, the Devils' defense continued to absolutely shine, proving October was no fluke. They were tops in the league in expected goals against per 60, shots against per 60, and scoring chances against per 60. If that standard could be kept up over the season, an elite defense might very well become one of the best the league had seen in years. And with the offense and goaltending seemingly coming around, let's just see. They kicked off December with a dominant possession game against the Canadiens, but their offense couldn't support their defense, and they dropped it. Back at the Rock for a second half of the home and home, another great Devils effort was choked off by a last-minute game-tying goal after this slew foot by Subban away from the play, and overtime solved nothing either. On to the shootout. Reed Boucher, to thunderous applause, was the first man up. After one fake, I don't believe it. He scored the first Devils shootout goal out of 15 attempts. Lars Eller just sniped his for another attempt where Schneider was just a little deep. Zajac tried the same move as last game, but didn't fool Budaj. David Desharnais stretched out Schneider like old linen, and Patrick Elias got Budaj to commit, but just let it go a split second too early. Devils lose. They completely dropped the ball against the Red Wings, and then Eric Jelena showed the Rangers the truth.
Boyle, Girardi, and Dominic Moore. Shot by Jelena, then he scores! Off the glove of Lundqvist!
And then, things started to change. On December 10th, against Zajac, Ryder, and Brunner all got on the board to overwhelm the Blue Jackets early. But it was just one of those nights where Martin Brodeur couldn't control any puck and didn't really move with confidence. And the Blues came all the way back to take it 5-4. Schneider was equally flimsy in the next game, but so was the entire skater core for the first half of the game. The Devils had only one win in 6 December games and looked completely different from the team that stomped opponents out at the turn of the month. Though they had broken the 500 mark on occasion, they had never really kept themselves afloat above it, much less create daylight between them and it. But a bounce-back performance from Brodeur against Tampa kickstarted the Devils back to being a playoff-caliber team. They smoked Ottawa, who was in a nearly identical standings position as them, and squeezed a point out of the red-hot Ducks 2 days later, though Damian Brunner would be injured and sidelined for the next month. Not good. At week's end, they would pull out a nail-biting win that shouldn't have been nail-biting because, again, despite playing well, Brodeur was shoddy between the pipes. And the same could be said for the entire Devils team in the following game, which Tom Galiti described as a 5-2 lesson taught by Chicago. The next 3 games were all against Metro Division opponents, and those 3 would take them to the halfway point in their season. But hand in hand with these looming matchups came hope for the Devils. Ryan Clough and Bryce Salvador would be making their returns. And while the Devils weren't great with them in the lineup before, their presence definitely wouldn't hurt. It didn't, but once the Devils' dynamite defense dragged their team past regulation, it didn't help either. Brodeur stood tall against the Columbus onslaught. A bit of puck luck went the Devils' way to tie it, and Travis Zajac nearly exploded the whole game, but it wasn't to be. Overtime went scoreless. The 6th shootout of the season was one the Devils desperately needed to win. Before his attempt, Jágr kissed his stick, but the puck must have been a cheap harlot because it rolled off his backhand at the last second. He just couldn't get it over the pad. Mark Letestu beat Brodeur, but not the knob of his stick. Listen to that sound. That's what luck sounds like. In his first game back, Ryan Clough, I think, just put this one more inside than he meant it to. But Ryan Johansson just shanked it altogether. But look at Brodeur, again, just a little deep. Elias just gifted the Devils' 3rd attempt to McElhinney, and Atkinson made a joke out of Brodeur to get the shootout's only goal. Devils lose. 1-for-20. The shootout was becoming a kind of laugh-it-off joke to Devils fans, who saw that their offense just wasn't good enough to really consistently take 2 points away anyway. So being a low-ish problem on the totem pole, 1 point from a shootout loss was seen as an acceptable deal, and not the warning sign that it should have been. Increasingly better puck possession and games of defensive ownership saw them get 5 points out of potential 6 against that Metro rival stretch to take them to the halfway mark of the season. Let's do a spot check on who's producing offense. The aspect of the play that the team is in the most dire need of. That would be Old Man Yager, leading the way by a mile. Obviously, I can't break down highlights from every game or we'd be here all week, but Yager was consistently a breath of fresh air for the Devils and their fans, and he probably deserved more points than he has here. Andy Green enjoyed a surprise third-place ranking in points, and Michael Ryder, brought in to replace Kovalchuk's goal scoring, was second on the team in goals. But on the whole, they needed more. Halfway through the season, the Devils had 2 players with more than 20 points. If even a few players potted a few more goals here and there wouldn't be so many stressful one-goal wins. By now, the writing on the wall was clear. With inconsistent offense and goaltending, the Devils were a team that would have to rely on the defense to ward off the other team's goal scoring, which would open up a window just wide enough where they could maybe notch 1 or 2. And given how consistently good they'd been at keeping the opponent's low event, that looked possible. It's a gamble, especially given what that might look like in the postseason, but the makeup of successful teams have been more odd than that, surely. The Devils started the year of our Lord 2014 with a valiant loss but late collapse against the Blackhawks, and then 2 uninspired losses to the Sabres and Flyers. In typical Devils fashion, the second week of the new year featured defensive slugfests with Corey Schneider standing tall in each. In the latter game, New Jersey was 3 seconds away from having to slog through another shootout, when
Travis wins the draw. Yager to Zidlitzky, fires, scores! With 1 second to play, and the Devils win it!
the momentum from the win carried over to their next game against the free-falling Toronto Maple Leafs. The Devils poured it on, but just couldn't score more than 2. And this time there was no last-second Marek Zidlitzky goal to lift them up in overtime. James Van Riemsdyk did that backhand flick thing. It's just good placement under the glove. Yager got Bernier to squat way back in his net, but brought it in anyway, and Bernier made him pay. Joffrey Lupul chunks his shot, but the changeup beats Schneider and goes off the bar. Ryan Clough tried a double deke, but Bernier stayed with him. Tyler Bozak missed the net, but all that means is that the Devils get another chance to not score in the shootout, even if it is Reed Boucher. The Devils lose. After 3 Schneider starts, Brodeur got the net in Game 48 and backstopped the Devils to their first multi-goal win in nearly a month. And then, stop me if you've heard this before, the Devils' defense shut down the Avs' offense, but the Devils' offense couldn't do anything productive. Schneider let in a shaky goal or 2, and we went the distance again. Matt Duchene was up first, and he opened up Schneider just enough to slip one by. Patrick Elias had Varlamov beat, but again, just let it go a little too early. That no-deke move that Elias does is so paralyzing for a goalie, and Varlamov was no exception here, but look at all that room. And it's not like Varlamov was sliding over, he's down. This should have been a goal, and Elias knew. Nathan McKinnon tried almost the same move as Duchene, but Schneider was wise to the act by now. Henrique had it roll off his stick and wide, and Ryan O'Reilly made them pay. The 6-game point streak would end against the Coyotes, but in the next game, the Devils did this. Nope, that's not a typo. It is 100% real. The Devils scored 7 goals. It may have helped that they could essentially play free of spectators, as only an alleged 2,000 showed up because of the snowstorm burying the area. It was more like 11,000, but that's still only half capacity. In the next game, Schneider once again limited the opponent to 1 single goal, and after how his past 5 starts had gone, a pattern was emerging. It seemed like he was finally getting his feet under him, creating even more daylight between himself and Brodeur. Before, he was below average, and Brodeur was way below average. But now, he was good, and Brodeur was still that. There was no sign of bounce back from the Devils legend, and fewer people had steadfast faith in him. But nonetheless, he got the start for the Devils in their next affair, the Stadium Series Classic against the New York Rangers on January 26th. In front of 50,105 fans, the Devils actually sprung out to a 3-1 lead in the first period. And then, the last positive vestiges of Martin Brodeur's career withered away in front of a national audience.
for 8 this year. Here's a chance. Oh, and it's off Brodeur and in! Brought on by John Moore. Fed went across. Zuccarello scores! 3-on-1. Brassard there across to Zuccarello. He scores! Litsky, Hagelin takes it on. Rifles one, he scores! Right back up the wing, and it's Stepan across. They score! The Rangers have made it 5 consecutive goals.
It's not that Brodeur wasn't the puck-stopping, third defenseman, offense-suffocating goalie he used to be, because that bar is insanely high. It's that he was one of the very worst in the league. Basic stats, advanced stats, all of them were unkind to him. I bring it up now because this was when the discourse really changed. No longer were the minority those who called Marty washed up. Now it was those who clung to the image of him that just did not reflect the reality of his ability anymore. Pete DeBoer was in the new majority. Corey Schneider started the last 3 games of the month. In the first, his offense gave him no help. In the next, a last-second game-tying goal was again given up, but the offense pulled out the extra point in OT. And in the third, he was fine. He was definitely the right choice in net, but the question of the lackluster offense remained. And it's not so much that they couldn't finish, though that certainly was part of the problem. They also just weren't creating shots. As much as the defense was giving the opponent absolutely nothing, the offense could barely outpace that, night in and night out. As the aforementioned John Fisher pointed out at the time, shot volume can be worked with, even if shooting percentage is more mercurial and obstinate. If the Devils had a league average shot volume per game, about 30 instead of 26, with their shooting percentage, they would have scored around 148 goals instead of 132. Think of the difference a 16-goal swing would make with all those 1-goal losses they had. It would have been enough to win 8 of them, or even just a lead-padding goal to stave off an eventual overtime game or shootout loss. It's not the most difficult fix to make, but man oh man, it would have made a huge difference. The month ended with Anton Volchenkov leaving the game early, thus ending a brief streak in which the team was without injury. The A-Train was signed to a 6-year contract after the 2010 season, and he just didn't live up to the billing. He was an old-school, physical, shot-blocking defenseman whose play just had not been at that level for a few years. His injury meant a roster spot for Peter Harold. He was a defenseman who's good in a sheltered role, but couldn't play in the NHL over long stretches. There was a hope at this point in the season that if there was going to be a trade, it would be a defenseman, traded in favor of a forward who could score. But it takes more than one forward to kick an offense into gear. Well, out of that depressing end to January came some good news. Corey Schneider, out of the freaking blue, was second in the lead in GAA. And in the 3 games before the Olympics, he played like it. In the first 60 minutes of each game, he allowed 1 goal. At 28, 24, and 25 shots, the offense, unfortunately, remained just as painfully par as ever. After the Olympics, the one remaining game in February was some long-awaited revenge against Columbus, lightly killing them in a 5-2 bout. They outshot the Blues 34-19. See? It can be done. Keep doing it. With 1 week until the trade deadline, the Devils still had time to make something happen to get additional help on offense. They didn't need it immediately, though, because they vaporized the Islanders 6-1. After staying at 500 in a pair of super close games, it was the time of the trade deadline. There was Marian Gaborik, Thomas Vanek, Ales Hemsky, but they started with Tuomo Ruutu, an expensive bottom sixer. For their next trade, they got nothing. That was it. That's all the Devils were able or willing to pull off in the 2013-14 season. The rostered players were going to ride out the rest of the year at the Rock, for better or worse. After a stinker against Detroit, Tuomo Ruutu would actually be the hero in a 5-4 win over the Canes. And don't look now, but the Devils had scored 4 or more goals in 5 of their last 6. It might have been clicking. Who knew Tuomo Ruutu was the guy? After a typically tight win over Philadelphia, they scored early and often, but coughed up the lead, dropping one against Florida, who were pretty bad. After that, they continued to seesaw, staying afloat by winning, holding on to early leads, or else losing games that they were never in, for nearly the remaining balance of March. By the way, lest it be forgotten, the Devils' defense, unbelievable. Still as stingy as ever. The fact that silver and bronze medals in these monthly categories were season worsts for them should speak for itself. It's not the kind of thing that highlight reels really quantify, but the 2013-14 Devils were putting in an all-time defensive season. Seriously. It's said that defense wins championships, and come playoff time, that is a maxim that the Devils could have full confidence in, and then some. They obviously weren't the problem. As we were reminded, with 10 games left in the regular season, it was the guys at the other end. After quickly falling behind 2-0, lucky bounces for Ryan Clough and Adam Henrique sent the game into OT. It solved nothing. For the first time since mid-January, just when you thought we'd escaped the shootout, here we go again. Though this time, the Devils' scores had been heating up all month. At this juncture, asking 2 or 3 of them to sink a breakaway opportunity wasn't a tall order. Damian Brunner had Greiss beat, but the butt end of his goalie stick just disrupts him enough to lose control. Mikkel Bodker once again sent Brodeur flying. Clough gets around Greiss' poke check, but just can't get the shot over the pad. Verbata sells Brodeur on the forehand, but shoots it right into his blocker to extend the pain of the Devils, who do exactly what you think they'll do. Lose. In the shootout, they are now 1 for 28 attempts. Next game. You can't escape it. Islanders up first, and the excellent Franz Nielsen maintains his excellence. Adam Henrique missed. Brock Nelson got one through the 5-hole of Schneider, and Patrick Elias switched up his routine to get something going.
Elias in on Nielsen, saved by Nielsen, and the Islanders hand the Devils inexplicably a 10th straight loss in the shootout this year.
1 for 30. As things started to look real bleak again for the offense, boom. A 3-goal explosion in the first period provided just enough of a cushion to win, but the Devils added on another 3, just their little treat, Against the Sabres and the most hideous jerseys you've ever seen, the Devils were ticked. They quite literally launched themselves at Buffalo's net, doubling them up in shot attempts, finding everything but the net. So we went to overtime. Now, do I even need to say, really, whether or not someone scored in it? Only difference, this one was coming off the back of a Devils team that was playing so well. It was one of their more dominant games of the entire season. They were feeling it. On Tyler Ennis' attempt, Schneider actually touches the puck twice before it goes in. Jacob Josephson, on his first attempt of the season, scores. Lewin actually played it pretty well. It was just really good placement from Josephson. Cody Hodgson just kind of shot. Brunner tried what Josephson did, because why not? But Lewin stayed with him. Zemgus Girgensons. With Zemgus Girgensons, Marek Zidlitsky had the chance to win the Devils' first shootout in 11... I'm sorry, I'm still laughing at Zemgus Girgensons. He had the chance to win the Devils' first shootout in 11 tries. After the most aggressive kick fake you've ever seen, Lewin gets just enough. Just enough. Drew Stafford hit Corey Schneider with a little bit of TJ Oshie, and that put the Devils on the hot seat. Yager has to score to keep the Devils' hopes of a second point alive.
He's going to come in now on Lewin. Yager shoots one, scores! Lewin got a piece of it. He thought he stopped.
The Devils just tripled their entire season's shootout success. Here's something hilarious. After this puck hits the inside of Lewin's right pad, it almost goes wide somehow, but it just catches his left skate on the backswing to ricochet in, saving the Devils from yet another heartbreaking loss. Marcus Foligno did nothing. Now it's Zajak's turn to possibly win it. He fired it off the post. This one is really tight, but maybe if Zajac took that extra quarter second, he could have placed it where he wanted it. Maybe. Schneider, sick of being beat 5-hole, shut Corey Conacher out. And now Tuomo Ruutu could win it. But you know how this goes. Brian Flynn gets Schneider to bite, but can't lift it up. Lewin's 5-hole opens about 37 times on Eliash's attempt, but he can't slip it by. Schneider stoned Agostini on the Sabres' 8th attempt of the night. Adam Henrique, stop me if you've heard this before, missed the net. To uproarious applause, Ville Leno sneaked one by Schneider. Now, the Devils have answered in this shootout twice already. Mike Sisla was just called up that day. Could he do it?
Who was recalled earlier today. Coming in now on Lewin with a backhand. Lewin beats him. And the Sabres win it.
3 for 39. But the Devils didn't wither. After losing Patrick Elias, Adam Henrique, and Jacob Josephson, all to injury, the Devils gutted out a wild win against the Capitals, a crucial one as they were both in the playoff hunt. The team absolutely deserved this win. Everyone left standing pitched in, winning battles, making stops, potting timely goals, you name it. They definitely got some breaks, but who cares? It was a true character win after a gutting loss. Against the surging Hurricanes, the walking wounded Devils won 3-1. Corey Schneider's second straight amazing game on a second straight night came behind another gutsy effort from the skaters. They got shut out for the 10th time that season against the Flames, though they had a whale of a game, they just couldn't beat Kari Ramo. And that brings us to Game 80, a game in which Corey Schneider and Robin Lehner were the best players on the ice for their respective teams. A game which featured little goal support from the Devils despite their masterful defense. A game which, like 11 before it, went to the skills competition. 2 games left in the season. This may be the Devils' only chance to eke out a win in the shootout. Zajac, Larson, Yager, and Zubris all miss. Carlson doesn't. Devils lose. 3 for 43. Do you hate the shootout yet? No? I can fix that. Franz Nielsen punches his team's first attempt 5-hole. Brunner got Nelson to bite on an early deke and scored the Devils' 4th shootout goal of the season. In Game 81. Josh Bailey did that controversial 360 move, and Brodeur shot the puck at him after the attempt. Yager got Nelson dead to rights, but just lost the puck. And Ryan Strome does the exact same thing as Josh Bailey and scores. That is the most disrespectful, deflating way for the Devils to lose this game. 4 for 45. In the very last game of the regular season, the Devils faced the Bruins, who were awesome that year, and they beat them. Martin Brodeur got the last start of the season, and a sub-900 save percentage notwithstanding, he got the last W at the end of a season that was his very worst. And how else was this regular season going to end than with a 1-goal win? Now let's take a minute to look at this team, because believe it or not, this is a historic team. Specifically, its defense. The overall expected goals for percentage of the 2013-14 Devils was 55.54. That may not sound super impressive, but of the 460 full or nearly full season teams since the metrics has been tracked, that is the 15th best. That's better than the 2016 champion Penguins, the 2024 champion Panthers, and the 65-win Boston Bruins of 2 years ago, the best regular season team in history. In terms of expected goals against, a metric you can more closely associate with defensive play, that rank increases to 5th. And you know what? The only teams ahead of them are the Sharks, Blue Jackets, and Red Wings in 2008, the very first season of advanced stats, which may very well have been pretty wonky due to a non-insubstantial margin of error, and the 2020 Wild, who played 13 fewer games due to the COVID stoppage. I think it's not too much of a reach to suggest that the 2013-14 New Jersey Devils, based on how few shots were allowed and how undangerous those shots were the most stifling, defensively effective team of the last 20 years. From day one all the way to the start of the postseason, the 2014 Devils held down the fort, often making up for the mistakes of the offense or the goaltending, and giving both of them a shot to make the difference. The 2014 Devils were among the best play-driving teams of the 21st century. The 2014 Devils were the best play-driving and best defensive team of that year. The 2014 Devils missed the playoffs. You might have seen this coming, but the shootout is the most heinous culprit in a slew of unfortunate reasons why this team, with its glorious, asphyxiating defense, did not make it to the big dance. The Devils were the only team without a shootout win that year, and even the only team that came close in losses still almost broke even. Do I even really need to explain how it is far and away the single worst shootout season a team has ever had? In 2013-14, the average team had 42 shootout attempts. The Devils had 45. They had a completely fair shake, as fair as it statistically could be, and they just couldn't score. Shootout failure is the purest form of a lack of scoring talent. Not offensive ability, not playmaking prowess, scoring talent. And that deficiency turned what should have been a playoff-caliber, defense-oriented team into golfers. And the hell of it is, they didn't miss by much. Get ready for some really, really depressing analysis. They were 6 points out of a playoff spot, needing 94 to surpass Detroit or Columbus. And one of their shootout losses was against the latter on December 27th. This was the game that marked the beginning of the end for this Devils team. They had just come back from Christmas break, being given plenty of time to adjust. It was Ryan Close's first game back from injury. It was in front of the home crowd. But nobody scored, and Brodeur didn't really make any saves either. If they beat Columbus that night in the shootout, the 88-93 gap becomes 89-92. If they beat them 2 weeks earlier on the 10th, a game where they had a 3-1 lead, only to blow it and give up a game-losing goal with 1:30 left, they overtake Columbus, 91-90. Or let's just keep it to shootouts. If they got the former shootout win against Columbus but not the latter regulation win, then they'd only need 4 shootout wins of the 13 to have the tiebreaker. Just 4 shootout wins of 13 tries. No other 13 shootout team in the 2010s had fewer than 5. On top of that, 18 post-regulation losses is tied for the most ever in a single season. It was quite literally unheard of, baffling, flabbergasting, a lodestone of incredulity. Nothing compares. Somehow the Devils' shootout shooting percentage was worse than their actual shooting percentage, and 8.9 is the 4th worst percentage of any team season. And among those bottom 4, heck, among the bottom 13, the only teams with a shootout percentage below 15%, not a single one had more attempts than the 2014 Devils. Of the shooters who ended up with 0 conversions, nobody had more attempts than Patrick Elias and Travis Zajac. Their misses of 7 and 6 respectively are the 2nd and 3rd highest amount ever. The highest offer is James Neal, and somebody might need to check on him. Allow me to twist the knife further. That 88-93 gap was also the product of one of the most odd circumstances in the history of the NHL. On March 10th, Rich Peverley of the Dallas Stars suffered cardiac arrest on his team's bench. Despite quick and heroic work from on-hand emergency staff, he asked to be put back into the game, because of course he did. The game, despite being 6.5 minutes old, was postponed, and then played in its entirety a full 60 minutes a month later. Nathan Horton had scored in the prior abbreviated game, so at opening puck drop, Columbus led 1-0. Probably the only time that the score has been something other than 0-0. Despite Columbus getting absolutely cratered by Dallas, Sergei Bobrovsky and his crew absolutely stole a win in one of the most unique scenarios you could ever hope to see. If they restarted the game from the top, why was the score not 0-0? If they were keeping Horton's goal, why not just start after the elapsed time from the prior game? In any case, it stood as a win for Columbus, and 2 extra points between them and New Jersey. It is the only time in hockey history you will ever see in the score sheet a goal scored at 0 elapsed time. But that's really digging deep into a bag of excuses, 1 in a million though they are. There were so many suboptimal trends that just never really regressed to the mean. One of the guys they brought in to help with scoring, Michael Ryder, had 16 goals in his first 46 games. In his final 36, he had 2. Martin Brodeur bottomed out this year, plain and simple. He never really recovered. He didn't re-sign with the Devils in the offseason and tried to give it a go with the Blues, but ultimately, it became a very inglorious, painful, slow end to a legendary career. On the team scoring front as a whole, Jágr was great, no complaints there. But in general, there just was not enough scoring. I've said it a million times, but that was the unfortunate truth. The all-time defense put them in a position in almost every single game to pull out a win, despite all the shortcomings of their roster. Almost every game. Think about how good your defense must be to give you a shot of winning, no matter how you played, that frequently. The ball was in their court, and they just couldn't do anything with it. If any of these things changed in the Devils' favor over the course of the season, they would not only have made the playoffs, but probably would have fit right in. But the abysmal shootout results cannot be ignored. They almost single-handedly, publicly, and embarrassingly torpedoed this otherwise historic season. To steal a few points back, they just needed a scorer. That kind of player who could really, really snipe. Whose purpose was to score and had the proven track record of doing it. There are a few players like that. 9 short months ago, there was a Devil like that, who did it like no other. As always, a massive thank you to each and every one of my patrons for supporting me. I couldn't do it without you, especially Connor Grindstaff, Pierre O'Connor, Nate, Jules, Jacob Keefe, Infernos Gaming, Steely Dan32, Stuckmund, Sky Shiver, Pylons Inn, Ethan Johnson, Amazing Kook 143, and Eric Sheldon.